October 27th was, as you know, the last full day of the missile crisis, the 12th day of the missile crisis. It was solved, the missile crisis was resolved on October 28th. Black Saturday, October 27th, was Fidel Castro's missile crisis. It was Fidel Castro's day. It was the day that Fidel Castro, characteristically, true to his psychology, true to all of his warlike beliefs, it was the day that Fidel Castro seized the initiative, literally, from Nikita Khrushchev and from President Kennedy. On that day, Black Saturday, Kennedy and Khrushchev were desperately trying to resolve the crisis peacefully. They were in negotiations, and as they were desperately attempting to resolve the crisis peacefully, Fidel Castro was stoking the embers of war and of conflict. Fidel later said, that day I was filled with the guerrilla instinct. He was feeling as a warrior, a provocateur, a conspirator, all of those things that he had been literally since his childhood and youth. Castro later recalled that on that day, October 27th, really even the night before, the night of October 26th, we saw no possible solution to the missile crisis. We saw no way out. He said we defended those missiles with affection. He was delighted to have the tactical nuclear weapons and the strategic weapons in Cuba. In the spirit of the guerrilla and the warrior, and feeling that hope was almost lost, that Cuba was going to be invaded very soon by the American military, Castro, on the night of October 26th, late afternoon, I guess, or evening, he went to El Chico, the Soviet military headquarters outside of Havana. And he told the military, General Pliev and the other Soviet commanders, we will not tolerate any longer the American reconnaissance overflights, the low-altitude reconnaissance overflights. Fidel had no power to affect the U-2s, no direct power to affect the U-2 reconnaissance flights that were flying at in excess of 70,000 feet. But he told General Pliev and the other Soviet generals, tomorrow morning, the morning of October 27th, we're going to begin firing with our anti-aircraft artillery against the low-flying American reconnaissance planes. He said, this, after all, this is just a pretext. They're flying these reconnaissance flights over all of our installations, including your missile sites, and this is all just a prelude to war. They're doing this so that when they do come in their first attacks to destroy the missile sites, we won't know what they're doing. We'll just be so accustomed to these flights that when they come genuinely to attack and destroy the sites, we'll be ineffective. Castro later recalled, he said, war began here that morning. So he stimulated what he later called war, as his anti-aircraft artillery brigades began firing on American American military reconnaissance flights. One of the Soviet generals who was in Cuba at the same time, with the chief of staff, or he was the advisor to the chief of staff. His name was General Gribkov. And Gribkov later wrote or said something very similar to what Fidel said when Fidel said, war began here on the morning of October 27th. Gribkov later said or wrote, the view among the Soviets, among all of the Soviets on the island, from lieutenants up to colonels and generals, was that combat had begun that morning, Black Saturday. We believed that all of the previous restraints on Soviet forces in Cuba were now superseded. So Fidel's talks with the generals, the Soviet generals, he apparently did not consult with them. He told them, we are going to begin opening fire on the morning of October 27th. Black Saturday began, to use Fidel's words, war began in Cuba. It was in that spirit of conflict with Americans, and specifically with American aircraft, American reconnaissance aircraft, that the U-2 was shot down that day. Rudolph Anderson, the American pilot, Air Force pilot of that plane, died in the wreckage of the plane when it crashed, when it came down near Banes in eastern Cuba. Two surface-to-air missiles were fired at the aircraft, and at least one of them completely obliterated the craft. Anderson apparently died almost instantly. Now, who was responsible for shooting down the U-2? I don't think there's any question. Michael Dobbs describes it, I think, in good detail from good, I think, reliable sources in his book, that it was the Soviet commanders, the Soviet generals at El Chico, who communicated the orders to Banes in eastern Cuba to fire on the aircraft, and for the reason that he mentioned. But they were motivated by Fidel's warlike attitude. They knew that Cuban artillery had already begun firing at American aircraft. And Fidel later took some credit for the shoot-down of the U-2. He said this: "The shoot-down of the U-2, the death of the American pilot, was the result of a situation created by our decision." He meant his decision to open fire on the low-flying reconnaissance aircraft. On another occasion, Fidel said, the Soviets, the Soviet generals, the Soviet missile base, they were not solely responsible. He accepted some of the responsibility. In fact, he was rather proud to have accepted some of the responsibility for the first casualty, the first military casualty, I think, of the missile crisis. There were other deaths. I think American, Cuban, Soviets died during the missile crisis. But I think Rudolph Anderson's death was the first one under enemy fire, so to speak. Nikita Khrushchev believed, perhaps, maybe I should say probably, erroneously believed, that it was Fidel Castro who was responsible, directly responsible, for the shoot-down of the U-2. Khrushchev said, yesterday, this was in a letter to Fidel, yesterday, you shot one down. And apparently Khrushchev believed that, whether he was misinformed or not. Castro later commented, Khrushchev sincerely believed this. Khrushchev sincerely believed that Fidel was personally responsible, directly responsible for the shoot-down of the U-2. Now, this is significant for a variety of reasons, and I'll be coming back to that. This Black Saturday, October 27th, was the day when Soviet and Cuban military forces joined in militant, belligerent solidarity. Cuban and Soviet military forces on the island began to act as one. And increasingly it was under the inspiration, if not the direct command, of Fidel Castro, not their own military commanders, not Soviet military commanders. Sergei Mikoyan, who the son of the Soviet advisor, Politburo member we heard a lot about in the first panel, Sergei Mikoyan said this. He said, "It was incredible. The Cubans and the Soviets were ready to die together to the last man." Gribkov, the Soviet general I mentioned, he wrote, "Soviet survivors of the U.S. invasion," and he included himself among them. This was a Soviet general. "Soviet survivors of the U.S. invasion planned to go up into the mountains and fight to the death as guerrillas alongside our Cuban comrades." They were that inspired, motivated by Fidel Castro. The Soviets, including Soviet generals. Gribkov said, "Castro had inspired us. He imbued us with his ideals and his resolution. It was the force and power of Fidel Castro's personality and his militants that was causing the Soviet military, from lieutenants to generals, and to use a term that's common among military in all countries, the Soviet military was going native. And it was relatively easy for them to go native in another sense because, as you know, they weren't wearing uniforms. Had they been in uniform, it might have been just a little more a little more unlikely that they would have gone native, but they were in all these checkered shirts, and they were identifying with the Cubans and not with their own commanders. Arthur Schlesinger, who of course wrote one of the classic biographies of Kennedy's presidency, Arthur Schlesinger was in Havana for one of the missile crisis conferences, and he later wrote that Fidel Castro acquired psychological command of all of the forces in Cuba. He fascinated and dominated them, Soviet forces and Cuban forces. So there were all of these things happening on Black Saturday, the last full day of the missile crisis. Kennedy and Khrushchev are desperately trying to resolve it, and Castro is trying to make it worse. He's trying to increase military confrontation. He opens fire with his anti-aircraft artillery barrages on American aircraft. It at least inspires, somehow has had shared responsibility for the shoot-down of the U-2. He's responsible for Soviet military going native, becoming more Cuban than Soviet. And on the night of October 26th, 27th, it was after he visited the Soviet high command at El Chico. As you know from one of the earlier presentations, he went to the Soviet embassy in Havana, in Vedado, and he dictated what commonly now is known as the Armageddon letter. I have a whole chapter in my new book about the Armageddon letter. In Castro's Secrets, I describe it in considerable detail, and how ashamed Fidel was after writing that letter. And the letter was not even revealed, it was not known outside of very small circles in Havana and Moscow. And there was a CIA source that actually had reported to the CIA about the letter, but I don't think anyone at the CIA believed it. That Fidel Castro actually urged Nikita Khrushchev in this letter to preemptively attack the United States with the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal if Cuba were invaded by the Americans. Castro was advocating global nuclear holocaust. He never admitted this until about 1990 or 91. It was Sergei Khrushchev, Khrushchev's son, who first let out, perhaps inadvertently, let out word that such a letter existed in Moscow. I think that was in 1989 when that first reference to the letter was mentioned by Sergei Khrushchev. My father received a letter from Castro recommending a preemptive nuclear attack on America. Well, when that hit the press, the Cuban and Soviet spokesmen all adamantly, even ferociously denied it. That's ridiculous. Nothing like that could have happened. Fidel didn't do that. The Cuban press denied it. Alexeyev, the Soviet ambassador at the time, who sat next to Castro when he dictated the letter at the Soviet embassy, Alexeyev, the man who actually translated the letter and then communicated it to Moscow, Alexeyev denied it. He said, no, nothing like that ever happened. And then finally, maybe it was 1991, when the third volume of Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs were published. They were known as the Glasnost tapes. And Khrushchev describes in that book the entire experience of receiving the Armageddon letter from Fidel Castro. So now there was no longer any denying it. Fidel had to own up to it. And he did, and it was extremely awkward and difficult for him to have to own up to it. I write about this in my new book, Castro's Secrets, and I tell about some things that Castro said in recent years about that experience. All the while, trying to deny full responsibility. But Castro also said about the letter, I had thought it out. It was a letter that he wanted Khrushchev to receive. Castro said, in the event of an American invasion, I would have agreed to the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And we've heard about the 98 tactical nuclear weapons that were in Cuba. He said, I would have agreed to use them. I wish they had given them to us. And he really wanted Cuba to become a nuclear power. He wanted to have control of those 98 nuclear weapons that we heard about earlier. Castro, I think, when he dictated that Armageddon letter to Khrushchev, I think Castro's calculus probably was oddly, bizarrely rational. I don't think that he slipped into a psychotic episode. I don't think he was losing touch with reality. I don't think it was a burst of magical realism. I think it was bizarrely rational in the psychological framework of this very, very unique person. Fidel knew that the tactical nuclear weapons were there. He knew that there were nearly 100 of these tactical nuclear weapons. They're battlefield weapons. Castro calculated, probably correctly, that had the American invading forces landed on the beaches, had American naval forces been right offshore, unloading and dispatching the American invasion force, Castro calculated, I think probably correctly, that tactical nuclear weapons would have been used against the Americans. And he said that had he any responsibility for it, he would have ordered, inspired, provoked, he would have urged Soviet leaders to fire the tactical nuclear weapons at the invading American forces. And there's a good chance after what happened with the U-2 that would have happened. We and the Soviets would have been in full-scale nuclear holocaust. Robert McNamara later said that if tactical nukes had been fired at American invading forces, the chances were 99% that America would have responded with a strategic counterstrike against targets in the Soviet Union and in Cuba. Now, Khrushchev was aware of almost all of this. Khrushchev was horrified when he received the Armageddon letter. Khrushchev was horrified, believing that Castro had personally taken responsibility, ordered the shoot-down of the U-2. Whether he did or not didn't matter. Khrushchev seemed to have believed it. Khrushchev knew that Castro had met with the generals on the night of October 26th and told them, didn't consult with them, told them that he was going to open fire against low-level aircraft on the 27th. Khrushchev knew, I think Khrushchev knew, that Castro really wanted to have his own tactical nuclear weapons. He wanted control of them. Khrushchev was terrified. It was all of this and many other things as well that caused Khrushchev, I think, hastily, hurriedly to reach the final accommodation with Kennedy on October 28th. He didn't even want to wait to communicate it through diplomatic channels. He broadcast his final resolution, his final acceptance of Kennedy's offer on Soviet radio. Khrushchev, we know now, could have gotten a better deal from Kennedy. He could have gotten a public acknowledgement of the removal of the Jupiters, but Khrushchev was in so much of a hurry to settle the missile crisis because of Castro's bizarre behavior that he wanted to just go ahead and get it done as quickly as he could on October 28th. So another bottom line of all of this, it's kind of interesting to contemplate this in the context of Fidel Castro. If this indeed was Fidel Castro's missile crisis, it was Fidel Castro, because of his own militant and belligerent behavior on Black Saturday, it was Fidel Castro who made the missile crisis come to an end prematurely from his point of view. Had he not behaved as bizarrely as he did, had he not terrified Khrushchev, maybe he might have been able to retain control of at least some of those tactical nuclear weapons that the Americans didn't even know about. But that became impossible. Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership were not going to leave tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba after Castro's behavior on Black Saturday. Thanks very much.